Welcome, listeners. Thanks for joining us today. So we're going to dive into a few really good topics today. One of them is around how do you build a cybersecurity from the ground up, and how do today's chief information security officers stay ahead in an industry that never stops evolving. So today in Future Secure, Jason and I are sitting down with Chirag Joshi, founder and CISO of Seven Rules Cyber. Now, his company is dedicated to helping organizations strengthen their cyber resilience. Chirag's extensive experience spans leadership roles in security, risk, governance across enterprise and government, giving him a unique perspective on the challenges and opportunities in today's cyber landscape. And something pretty exciting for me is this week on Tuesday and Wednesday is the Quantium CISO conference up in Sydney, a really important gathering of our chief information security officers, sharing information, talking about the challenges in 2025 and beyond. And I've got the two hosts with me. Chirag is hosting Tuesday and Jason is hosting Wednesday. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Well, Jason, my co-host. And I'm just going to throw over to you, Jason, to welcome Chirag and fire off the first question.
I will do, mate. Yeah, it's good chair and chair, the two chairs. So I think Chirag will be holding me up more than the other way around. So he gets day one, lays the groundwork, and I just come in and do a Stephen Bradbury on day two and just skate on through. So it's nice and easy. This is it's good to be back because we haven't. I'm trying to think. Maybe it was 22. I think that we did the last pod together. Remember we did some clips back. I think it might have been 21 or 22. Yeah. Back a bit, but yeah, obviously, you're very well known, but for people who might not know your story, Tom and I are interested in how you sort of got to where you are, because it's been an interesting journey. Can you give the watchers and listeners just a bit of a background story on sort of how you got to where you are today? Go as far back as you want. Some people do go back to birth. I think Vaughan Shanks went all the way back to. So I was born at a very young age, and he went that far back. But
and the computer appeared in front of me.
That's right. Yeah, I came straight out of my mum, and I was straight onto a computer.
There was an Apple there.
But tell us your story, mate, because it's I know a bit of it. It's been an interesting one, but for me and the listeners, it'd be good to just get a bit more background.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Tom. And it's amazing just being here with you guys. You guys have been doing some great work, as I was telling you. And it's definitely getting noticed in a positive manner. The open conversations is adding value to our industry. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Look, in the ways of my background, I won't go all the way far to my birth because I don't want to bore your listeners. But hey, there could be some fun stories that I can share with them later. But in terms of my professional background, I'm an engineer by education. So I'm an engineer in electronics and telecommunications. And then I got my master's degree in telecommunications management, which was a mix of business school and engineering. And I think that has always been kind of something that has been of very keen interest to me, is how do you apply technical skills to solving business problems. And this is even before I knew the extent of business problems. And as a student, when you're kind of going to university, you think you know everything, but you don't. But even at that time, it was always about how do you apply these things in a practical sense. That is what drove me. I Unlike some engineers, who I have a lot of respect for, tech, for the sake of tech, did not interest me. So that is where I found myself, even in the extracurricular activities in universities, doing a lot of debates, running cultural councils and so forth, because I think that's the human part, which was always of interest to me. But my initial roles in my professional career were in the systems engineering, systems analysis space. So I started my career there, and I was one of the more fortunate ones who got into what we call today as cyber pretty early on, because one of my early things that I had to tackle was PCI DSS, and this was in a restaurant hotel environment, part of a university. So quite unique in its mission, but also if you know much about the U.S. universities, especially the sports scene, college football is massive. And the university that I graduated from and I was working for, like, they have a massive college football program and other programs as well, basketball being one of them. But the impact of the retail, the restaurants, the hotels is quite significant in that context. So being part of PCI DSS journey in there, I think that was really good. But then, I got opportunities. I think this is where sometimes, you get lucky breaks, but it's also, to me, it's just asking yourself and challenging yourself is what is next for you. And it doesn't just mean hopping jobs. It means like how do you grow in the next level. And actually for me, that translated into moving across to Colorado, where I got into more of a cyber governance role. And this was essentially, a central, think of it as a corporate office, and you have four major university campuses. So, and each of them were very unique. One was a medical campus, the other one was a major research university. Then you have an urban campus. So, very, very different in terms of the type of people who were there, the mission, the focus areas, and being able to look at cybersecurity governance, look at all the things that go into risk management, policy setting in that context. It teaches you a lot because there's no one size fits all, and you get to witness firsthand the impact of your recommendations on patient outcomes, for example. And
Mm.
I think that's when you start to take it much more seriously beyond just data. Like it's human lives. I think that connection comes organically when you actually are part of that equation. And these are the early days where NIST CSF did not exist. It
Mm.
was still 853 and one of the earlier versions. So I got fortunate with that exposure of using those things to come up with things that made sense, as opposed to the you know here's a checklist of things, and if you follow them you'll be okay. It doesn't really work that way. So that was good. I got lucky in my career with a lot of great mentors, but also associations. So ISACA, that has been a
Mm.
very important part of my professional and personal life. I became a member at an early point in my career, and all the certs I got through that, really helped in shaping my thinking.
Mm.
But I look back and it's quite amazing, right? The first day you walk into one of these ISACA branch meetings, and
Mm.
you see all these people and presenters, and you just kind of wide-eyed. And then all these years later, when you are a vice president and actually setting the stage,
You're
you
them.
remember that. And I think that's the
Yeah.
experience that you want to give, right?
Mm.
But yeah, look, I mean, that's been a lot of the early days. And then progressively, when I moved to Australia, I was fortunate. I guess I say that because I worked across many different industries. Some of it has been by design, some of it has been by happy coincidences, right? So energy, government, uh, universities, financial services, uh, and that gives you a unique appreciation of what's different, but also what's common. Uh, but then you start to, when you have that, and because you haven't just been in one place for 20 years, uh, that's good and bad.
Mm.
It's For me, it was good for the most part, is because it forces you to adapt your thinking, your approaches, the way you communicate to a set of audiences who are quite different. The regulatory landscape they're exposed to is different. The people on the boards are very unique. The type of people they service, the customers, that definition can be very unique. Like in universities, there is not that customer definition as it being financial services, but look at the number of stakeholders and the different variety of stakeholders in universities, and I think that's where you start to appreciate it better. Along the journey, I think I've always enjoyed teaching, and that comes to me as a way of like explaining things in a simple manner, and that translated into a lot of speaking things that I did. But then the first book that I wrote, which was around how do you I've always thought of cyber as a human issue, but how do you actually make it relevant beyond awareness and training? And how do you learn from disciplines such as neuroscience, public health campaigns, behavioral psychology, and apply them? So that was my first book, really. And I wrote it for myself more than anything else, something I wanted to do. But the reception I got, and I was really fortunate. People enjoyed it. A lot of people invited me to speak on the back of it, and that resulted in my second book, which was now taking it to the next step. Is all right, cyber has now become a boardroom issue. It's in living rooms. We don't have to talk about cybersecurity is important anymore. I think people generally get that aspect. It's the next level. And for me, that was about how do you bridge that divide between what's technical and what's business in a sensible manner, right? Not to
Mm.
dumb things down, but to simplify them. And that's where the seven rules came in. The first book was Seven Rules. The second book was Seven Rules. And it is, for me, it was a simple way of like putting things down succinctly, things that you can remember. So even today, because I get involved with so many different things in our businesses that I run, I'm involved with volunteering work, my consulting work, my board work. Sometimes it's good to go back to first principles, and those are seven
Mm.
principles for me. So that's where the seven rules cyber journey came from, and getting close to 2 years of running this business along with a couple of other things that I do. Uh, I've learned a lot, and I've learned a lot in terms of, how do you actually deliver value, because you think in your mind there's a way to do it, but then the market also responds to it. But then it's also about you believing in your convictions. Like, you have some convictions in your own professional journey, that just because you're out there with the consulting business doesn't mean you go wherever the wind takes you. You got to have your own convictions that guide you. And for me, I've been really fortunate for that to actually have eventuated into good business opportunities, but also, like yourselves, a good respect among your peers, which is really important, because your peers are the ones who actually know you best. I think it's easy to impress people who don't know much about cyber by saying things, but it's really hard when you have, our cyber folks are quite cynical sometimes, just by the
Mm,
nature of our profession. For us to get respect among that community, that to me means a lot, because that means we're doing something right.
mm. Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, it's been good watching the journey and watching it grow over the period as well. And I think just on that, the seven rules. Can you just give us a brief of that for people? Because I think that's pretty important, just to see how you've chunked it down. Because Tom and I are always trying to find like the slip, slop, slap of cyber. For
Yeah.
one end of the spectrum
Sticky
and
idea.
going through. Yeah. So can you just give people just the top line stuff? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people that are looking for a resource like you've got, and I think it's excellent the way it's done. Just give us some quick pointers on that, because I think that'd be really beneficial for the audience
Yeah,
if you don't mind.
absolutely. Happy to. And look, I encourage people to check out 7rulescyber.au, where I kind of
Mm.
explain them in more detail.
Yeah, we'll put
But
that in the show
simply put,
note links as well. Yeah, so
Very
yeah,
good.
sounds great. I think so. Simply put, right? The first principle is cybersecurity is about the business, right? That's rule number one. It does not exist for its own sake, and that's easy to say. But how do you actually make it happen?
mm,
What are the resources that you need to know about? How do you practically engage with the business, right? And a lot of times, cyber folks spend a lot of time talking about things with technology people. We spend over 80% of our time talking to technology people, for argument's sake, and that's not good enough, right? We got to spend time with the business, but that depends on the nature of your role. But my principle and the rule is about, no matter what your role is, and I mean, you could be a SOC analyst, you could be an architect, you could be a CISO. You still have that obligation to understand what your business does, what brings in the revenue, who do you serve, and get specific about that. And I think that serves as a key foundation of everything else. So that's rule number one. The rule number two is around, cyber is a risk management exercise. There is no right, there is no wrong, for the most part, right? There is some things now, there is a regulatory requirement that might, you might need to meet, but for the most part, it's a risk management exercise. And you are better off, even with regulatory requirements, to actually look at things in the risk context. And what do I mean by that? And this is a conversation that is so important when I talk to boards. Is the boards and executives have an obligation to kind of inform and set that risk appetite, but CISOs have an obligation to actually have that conversation around cyber risk appetites. And these are not broad statements saying we have low appetite for data breaches. That doesn't mean much. It's actually going down next level. So how do you do that meaningfully? And that's a big area of focus for me right now in cyber risk quantification space, because I think we are at a point as an industry, with the technology we have, with the data points we have, we can actually quantify cyber risk with a high degree of confidence. So that's rule number two. And then other rules talk about, the right measurements that you need to have. It talks about cyber as a human fact is essentially the human part of cybersecurity. It goes into that rule. But then there are a couple of rules that are relevant to security strategies and implementation of strategies. But then I also wanted to focus on we as professionals, and one of the rules talks about building an authentic brand, and it doesn't just mean for you; it means for your teams as well. And a lot of times, cyber teams do great work, but it does not get noticed, because the nature of our jobs is, if we do it well, people shouldn't notice. But I also think it's important for people to notice when we are doing the right things. And that requires us to, we don't have to go on LinkedIn like I do, or you do, Jason and Tom, like in terms of sharing things. That's fine. That's amazing. I would actually highly encourage you to do that. But if you can't, even within your organizations, there is so many opportunities. Like, I've in my past roles run things like showcases, where I've gotten my team members to come and talk about what do they do to the organization, right? Record that so people can look at it. And people are really interested to see what do cyber people do. But that's a great good way of also messaging and building a brand for your team, that these are accessible, approachable people who are doing some really simple things that I understand, but also really hard things that I don't understand, but I value. So those type of principles inform the seven rules. which to me extends from, how do you think from a very strategic perspective, and then slowly brings it down to how do you actually implement and run cyber strategies, and then finally how do you kind of grow as a person, and what are the soft skills. What I call in my rules is differentiating skills. I don't want like this the term soft skills. It's differentiating skills. Why? Because if there are two people with equal technical skills, these skills like storytelling, communications, reading the room, that set the the one person apart from the other person. And I think that's something in our industry. The more we get exposed to everyday people, by the virtue of our roles, and I mean businesses, it could be our customers, customer facing CISOs. I think that reading the room is so important, and that aspect of having that empathy, where why haven't you patched it yet? It's all trending red, but just taking a step back and understanding why that has not happened, that also requires that empathy of putting yourself in another person's shoes while driving an outcome. So I think those are the skills that are equally vital in addition to everything that we do in cyber.
Yeah, because CISO is a tough role, right? And I think especially in Australia, I know I was doing an event yesterday, and John O'Driscoll was there as well, and he was I think he was the first CISO at Vic Gov, and at the time he was the only CISO, and
Yeah.
255,000 people, multiple different departments. I think Victorian Gov must have something close to 20 CISOs now, sort of in the environment, but back in the day when he started, and this was something exactly what you're talking about, is exactly what he was doing, mate, is that it was, it gets down to, and it is that human element, and it's not just a human element at the end of the computer, but it's a human element always when you're developing and trying to grow something. And this is an ever evolving and changing industry, right? So unlike, doing accounting where, the number always equals the number,
Mm.
debit and credit, source of use of funds, a balance sheet and P&L don't lie unless you sort of, manipulate the numbers a bit. But at the end of the day, 1 plus 1 always equals the same, right? And in cyber, that's not the case. And the stress that people are under, and especially at a CISO level, I think gets missed a lot, right? And doesn't get understood, So I think this is something that we need to talk more about and actually get out in the open. And we sort of were talking before we got on here that there's a lot of people struggling, and the stress of
Mm.
being a CISO is that you're only one incident away from maybe not having a job. There's not many jobs where you can get a million things right and just do something wrong once and not have a job, right? There's not many jobs like that. A classic example would be someone who presents the weather or works at the Bureau of Meteorology. How often do they get the weather wrong, right? So it's just something where you got to go, we need more understanding of the industry. And I think what you do and the way you explain things is a really good point, because it actually does give people a good insight into how to handle it and what to do. And there's not many people out there doing that. So what else have you found, especially over the last few years? And I think COVID probably turned up the volume on that a bit too. Have you seen best mechanisms of coping with the job?
Yeah, look, yeah, I mean it's and I echo all the points that you mentioned there, Jason, with regards to uh, the stress that CISOs face, and before we kind of jump on to a couple of other things, I do want to say that I teach. I run these workshops. I run strategic cyber leadership workshop for CISOs, for two ICs, to CISOs. And what I start with, right, is there are different personas of CISOs. The
Hmm.
word CISO, the title CISO, uh, is not the same thing everywhere.
No,
It doesn't mean the same thing to every industry. And it is not.
hmm,
I'm not even talking about how big your team is. I'm
no,
talking about the nature of your role itself. There are strategic CISOs whose job it is, to actually interface consistently with executives and boards. There are technical CISOs who are appropriate for startups, for technology companies, and they're very hands-on, right? They're actually hands-on to technical tools. There are BISOs, business CISOs, who might have that linkage, who actually do not probably report into the CISO. They might actually report to the business for the most part. But that role is fundamentally different in terms of the outcomes it tries to drive. There could be customer facing CISO. So I think it's really important to know where you fit in when you even
hmm,
before you take the job. I think it's important to realize and make sure that you and the either CIO or CEO or whoever is hiring you are on the same page with regards to where do they see your role. Because far too often that's where the problem starts. You thought you were taking a strategic CISO role, they thought they were getting a technical CISO, or vice versa. And
mm,
I think that to me is an issue. But also the liability on CISO is increasing. That's why there are insurance now for CISO specifically to get to protect themselves, essentially for reset. Like imagine that,
mm,
right? Like there's a
mm,
whole industry coming around that because of that reason. So no, I think there's a lot there which we can unpack, a whole episode to itself in terms of that size evolution. But to your point about what I've been focusing on, and I talked about defensible cyber investments as being a key part, because if you think about all the digital transformation, so you mentioned COVID and post COVID, massive digital transformation happened by by need, by the virtue of us just needing to go online and just do everything online and live our lives online for some time, unfortunately. But that turbocharged things.
mm.
That also brought in investments, and I think that period coincided, in a weird way, with a lot of regulatory changes. So you had this massive push of regulations. You had a massive push of digital transformation driving businesses. You have people living their lives differently, working differently. All those things came together. I'm not even going to go AI route just yet, but even before that, before
Hang
AI
on, hang
became such
on.
a
What did you
mainstream
say
thing,
then? Yeah, Tom,
I'm saying.
this is going to be new. We have this has not come up on the show before, so we have to go
No,
there.
never spoken about AI. Hey, we did well
Never-
20 minutes before it came up.
Yeah, that's
There
right.
we go.
We've done
So
very
I'm
well.
not
Yeah,
even but we'll actually extend that even more. So we'll not talk
yeah.
AI for now. But even with all these changes, I think it's what happened though is organizations started investing in cybersecurity, not in a very structured way. And
Mm,
even where they were investing, they were tying themselves to a maturity model. What do I mean by that? Is and this is just across the patch, right? Like,
mm.
and I'm just going to be open and honest here. I'm talking, right? Is so
About
everybody
time.
wants to
We
get to
got there,
a
Tommy. We got there.
right. It's like
Bring it
NIST
on. Bring it
CSF.
Pulled the
on.
scab.
Yeah, yeah. Let's
There
go.
we go. Yes, just so it might annoy some people, but people bring
That's all
up
right.
this NIST CSF
We do that
maturity
all the
scores,
time.
right? We should do more of it.
Yeah.
But it's we say, oh, we want to get to maturity level 4, and
Mm,
everybody's at maturity level 2 about, right? And then that journey started of getting to 4. The problem with that type of a thing, there's nothing inherently wrong with thinking about maturing controls. That's amazing, right? The
mm,
problem with that is once you get to 4, what's the answer, right? Like, are you going to stay there? Is that 4 or that maturity level appropriate to your organization? Is that actually guided by your cyber risk appetite of the organization? On one
mm,
side, if you say, well, I have a very low risk tolerance for for data breaches, or in some cases zero tolerance, are your patching timelines actually supportive of that, right? So
mm,
to me, I think when we start with that, it becomes hard to actually be defensible, and it does not go well with the threat landscape either. And we all did that. I'm not saying that I
mm,
haven't done that. I think we all did that because that was the extent of the maturity that people were getting as an industry. But I think times come to move beyond that, because we realize that cyber cannot be funded as a project. That was a problem a lot of CISOs ran into, is they got a lot of funding for that 3-year period, and then the funding tapered off.
mm,
uh, because you sold something as in, are we going to reach this maturity? And it's like, okay, fine, we're at that maturity now, why do you need to keep spending all this money? Well, sustaining that is a different thing. But
mm,
also threats change so quickly, and how is that maturity model actually responding to what changes quickly? And that is why, to me, defensible cyber investments actually, why we all say that it was not being practiced, which is why even the issue of security tool sprawl, where you have all these technologies that people bought without that mindful thinking of, why am I getting all of these different tools? Should I go the platform route, best of breed route, a mixed route? Is that thought through? What are the implications on that? People bought a bunch of tech that just sat there or did very little of what it was supposed to do, and a lot of money was wasted. So I think now we are at a point, in my view, is which is why I always talk about reasonable and proportionate measures. Because one,
mm,
regulatory language is using it, the boards understand that, but we can actually translate that into things that are reasonable and proportionate, which means that it could change. Like what we set as a strategy this year could change quite a bit next year if the threat landscape changes, if our business changes, if we acquire some companies, if we enter new geographies. And this is where historically, I mean, that's where I think our defensible investments were not realized, because we started with that maturity, and maturity was even a good thing, right? Some people started with a compliance view. Are we going to
mm,
meet ISO 27001, and that's our security strategy? or we're going to do essential 8 and that's our security strategy. I'm saying that's a low baseline. If you haven't done anything before, maybe you start there. But for a lot of us, I think it's time to move beyond that. And that to me is something I talk about a lot. And once you get to that, right? I mean, I understand why people do it. And
Mm.
for your listeners, I want to leave them with this is because if you think like a board director or if you think like an executive, and if you give them a checklist of things to do, and once you do them, you're okay, that's where people will gravitate. But then you kind of you pigeonhole yourself in that situation where you are now going to be judged by a binary equation as opposed to cyber, which is such a multifaceted problem because you are not presenting the true threats and risks that were relevant. You are not able to say hand on heart what is the confidence of an event actually happening, confidence percentage of a likelihood, and the magnitude of loss that could be at stake. And what are the 4 or 5 controls that would make the most difference? And they might not be essentially. They could be essentially, they could be something else because your business actually might not have much Microsoft in them, for argument's sake, right? Uh, and that's why I think we need to evolve beyond that. And that's a lot of my work currently. And I went on a bit of a rant there because I'm really passionate about this because I've seen a lot of good money being spent
Mm.
for very little in the ways of outcomes.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And culture is at the heart of so much about what you've been talking about, and this seems to be the real struggle. It's a new industry, okay. I very much like defensible cyber investments because Jason and I have spoken to a lot of people, and some of our clients last year. Their sole role was to come in and help a company organize all the different software and tools that they bought and vendors into something that is strategy. So. How do we kind of, and how are you two planning on talking at the conference next week about these cultural issues and kind of weaving in some of these things, Chirag, that you've been talking about just now? Because it's obvious that we've got to change and kind of evolve. But how do you bring the CISO community along with you?
Uh, Look, I think for me, it's with the CISO community, right? And partly is the pressures that are going to drive this. Unfortunately, is the budgetary challenges that are facing all of us will drive some of that idea of like what's reasonable, what's proportionate. The other thing that is, and this is where if we don't do it, it'll be done for us as CISOs. Is the boards and executives are getting much more educated about cybersecurity. This is not 5 years ago where boards were just figuring it out. Things like
Mm.
SOCI in the SOCI Act, Security of Critical Infrastructure Act in Australia, the Cybersecurity Act, which passed late last year. All these things will now necessitate a fair bit of changes across the leadership in terms of cyber, literacy, but also a deeper understanding. So we need to be able to put ourselves in a position of when we ask for investments, what's the return on investments, right? We need to talk that language, and I get it. Actually, I've spoken to some not-for-profits, and that may not work for them, right? That terminology. But then the question is, how do you assess if you're spending smartly, if what you're spending for
Mm.
you're getting the outcome? And culturally, how does that translate to your point, Tom? Culturally, there are a fair number of tactical things that need to happen and strategic things. I think the most important thing is, you aligning with your leadership as a CISO on your cyber risk appetite. And I mean actionable cyber risk appetite statements. So it should tell us precisely how far do we go with implementing our controls because it's dictated by the appetite. And that should relate and that should go back to your investment profile. Because if you decide to spend $1 million and you agree to accept that there'll be 10 percentage of your assets that might not be completely covered for whatever reason, right? You might have because you can't spend $5 million. Uh, if an incident or an event were to occur because of that 10% that you accepted, that's what you accepted. That's a cost of doing business that you accepted because you do not want to go as far. If you want, hey, I don't even want 10%, I want 1% exposure. Well, that
Mm.
increases the cost profile. But these are the conversations you need to have. Be confident in having these conversations. And you cannot really have these conversations unless you get a handle of the business. And I've seen, it becomes hard, right? As a CISO, when you start your job, you get stuck with audit findings. You get stuck with some historical work that your predecessor did in terms of a program of work or some maturity assessment or something. You get stuck with that. You don't have the headspace to go and look at your annual statements, talk about the revenue channels, talk about where the revenue growth is coming, talk about what new products are going to be launched and the impact that you will have there. That's where you need to put yourself in because all the things that I talked about earlier you cannot really meaningfully have. And there are and that's where a lot of time I spend is with those things. Culturally, another thing we need to do is actually be able to be in a position where we don't talk about culture just in awareness and training. We actually talk about key decisions being made. So when you decide as a business to go live with a product or a feature, uh, accepting certain cyber risks in them, I think that's a culture issue. It's a culture issue when you decide to, take a system down outside of a change window because it has critical vulnerabilities in them, even if it means missing your availability requirements. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's a culture issue, and a culture could be a risk-based culture where you can actually make those calls. The worst thing you can do is not do this in a in a sensible, meaningful fashion, and just let things take over. So these are the things I want to talk about and open up conversations for.
Yeah, I think the culture thing goes a bit wider than that as well. Like in what you're saying there is that, and when you look at an organization, even culturally, if you're trying to train staff on awareness about cyber, you're better tying that to things happening at home rather than work. Because that you got to think that the psychology of people, regardless, most attacks happen due often, whether it be at work or home, due to human error. Now that percentage varies widely, from in the 60s up into the 90s, depending on who you ask and who you're talking to. But if there is the human that is actually making that mistake, whether it be at home or at work, unless you can tie that to something they care about, they might not care about work, but they'll care about their family being involved in attack and losing money, right? So culturally, you got to understand all levels of business from the top down because there's director's responsibility, yes, but also you're a director of your own home. So if you lost the money at your home,
Absolutely.
the care factor's got to be in there. And I think with both of us cheering that day with CISOs, I think we still need to keep bringing it back to that because sometimes you can get so sucked up the tube that you're at the top worried about things that you need to bring yourself back down and ground in reality as well. Is that the average person that's doing it has got to do their job and they've got to do it in a timely manner, and you've got to take those things into account. And people still do work remotely and from home, and they are prone when they're busy to making mistakes. I had a friend of mine call me the other day whose daughter lost $20,000, heavily pregnant, still a kid in nappies, changing a nappy,
Mm.
gets a phone call, transfers 20 grand, she thinks, into a GST account from one of the banks, and that's gone, right? So it's just a timing thing, bad timing. She's busy. 5 minutes later, she realizes what's happened. She rings up the bank. Too late, the money's gone, right? Now, that's someone who's running their own business who's just lost 20 grand. Now, to someone running their own business, we know with a cyber attack that 60% of businesses go out of business within 6 months after a cyber attack.
Yes.
And that's often because, we talk about these big businesses and we see the Medibanks and the Latitudes and the Optuses of this world and getting hit. But it's the small business when they lose, 60,000 or 100,000 or, 800,000, which I've seen, before, that go out of business, right? And they might have been employing 10 people and it's a knock on effect of all that sort of thing. So it's that supply chain risk, isn't it, too, Chirag? That it goes through a lot deeper into there as well. It's not just your business, it's all the people you touch outside of that we've got to think about as
You
well.
absolutely, and I think you nailed it there. And that to me, which is why I talked about my first book, which was on essentially this idea is making it personal to to people. Also, role based training, and it's not just about role
Mm,
based training in the classic sense of developers get secure coding. But I mean role based as in make it relevant to what they have to practice every day.
mm,
And that's why awareness programs work best when they are focused on two or three behaviors that they want to change. And I think this behavior start there. And to your point, I think there is a massive, and this is where I'm a big fan of AI. I think it's going to do a lot of good for us. But I think we are seeing that these scams and these issues that you mentioned, Jason, are becoming so much more prevalent. It's become so easy to do this, and which is why I think we have an obligation to even have more of these advocacy and awareness programs. Which is why, like in my role as the national ambassador for critical infrastructure, ISAC, I think that's something
mm,
I'm really passionate about is bringing that message to at least the critical infrastructure community because that actually impacts people directly. Like critical
mm.
infrastructure is called that for a reason, right? It's critical
Correct.
to our economy, our safety. Uh, but that's where the culture of sharing comes in, and meaningful, purposeful sharing of threats, of ideas, of things coming together, which is why even the work that you are doing with your initiative there, Jason, with the Australian cyber
Cyber
center that
network.
you're
Yeah.
bringing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's been really important is uh, I think it's not just tackling them in silos,
Mm,
but it's also coming together. But coming together to solve a problem more purposeful is where I think we should do it, because I think our industry, unfortunately, there are a lot of groups that form, right?
mm,
But do they actually solve what is there to be solved? And some are okay, some are what I call as just you're there with people to share, and there's open, just share your problems, what's there. But there are some that actually drive an outcome, and I feel like both of them have their place. But culturally, I think, and this is maybe a message for organizational leaders too, is let your cyber teams, trust them to go out and speak at events, right? Do your
Mm,
media training, do whatever you need to, put them, whatever you have your process, right? But I find it so like that people like find it so hard to go even and share ideas because there are all
mm,
these different restrictions on them. We can't be talking about cybersecurity as a collective good, as a common good, hits everyone, affects everyone, and then have all these barriers to sharing good information because of what we may perceive, and it could be antiquated practices. And I'm not
mm.
saying that those things don't have a role, but like let people go and actually have a conversation, right? Trust them to share what is open to be shared without oversharing. But I've seen too many CISOs and too many good security people just confined because their organizations won't let them go and talk publicly.
Yeah,
And
same.
that to
Yeah.
me is a missed opportunity.
It is, yeah, and I think it's good you mentioned the CII SAC. It was good to see David and Scott finally get that and get some funding finally.
How good
After
was
all the
that for
lobbying
them? No,
for yeah. I mean, I
lots of
remember
hard
speaking to
work.
him a couple of years ago when I was at our cyber, and we started that conversation, and I know how hard that journey is, and obviously as well, from first meeting those guys, and Scott's been on it for years, and you've got to keep chipping away, chipping away, chipping away. But as you say, and we sort of spoke before we got on here, is that we need to be sharing this stuff because you learn from your mistakes. That's
Yeah,
how, and if a company gets popped, they usually become stronger from it, because you learn more from, actually getting attacked and actually going through an incident than you do from not. It's all theory. You can do as many tabletop exercises or incident response practice runs as you like, but nothing beats the reality of actually going through one, right? And we need to share that more. I agree with you, mate. This is something I've been banging on about for a while, is that if something happens, what happens in Australia, we shut the blinds down and we fix it behind the scenes. And when no one knows what's going on, right? And then it's 3 or 4 a year later, they start to open up and you heard little bits about the Optus thing or you hear little bits about it, too late. If you don't hear about it within the first couple of days or 48 hours, it could be too late or at least 2 months, right? These attacks and these attack surfaces, if we're not patching and protecting and doing these sorts of things, we're stuffed, right? So yeah, it's
yeah.
look. I think it's going to be good. And I remember we went to the event last maybe 2 years ago. I think I was doing day two. There was someone else who will remain nameless on day one. I think we sat at a table together, and that guy shouldn't have been in front of the room. But it's good to see a proper cyber person up on stage, and I love seeing your stuff, and I love the way you present as well because I think you do like you're doing here is break down the stuff down into really bite-sized chunks. I like also what you and Branko are doing, with regard to startups. That's something that I'll announce soon. It's something that I'll hopefully work in conjunction with you guys. There's $100 million fund that I'm talking about a bit later today that we'll do for startups, and it's that model that I've spoken about before quite openly. Is
Yeah.
that I've formed a group of people who have done $1 billion businesses and stuff like that, and we're going to do a 12-week residency of people that have actually gone and exited at 9 and 10 figures and stuff like that to go and get people. But we're going to say, here's the top 5 things we need to solve for in Australia. And I want to work with you guys to do the same thing. It's, the rising tide lifts all boats sort of thing. The government wants sovereign capability, and Michelle McGuinness will be talking, and
Mhm.
Dan Tripovich, obviously, on day 2 there, right? And Tom and I are doing some work with Michelle also in Canberra this Friday coming up as well,
Nice.
to get the messaging across and then help. It's this collaboration piece and that government gets to speak to and that we all work together to be on the same page because like the attackers, if we can share the best of the best and get that messaging clean and actually get it through to the right people, that's where we make a difference, by collaborating, working together and saying, how can I help you? Like I always say to you, and you know that on the side is, if you need any help, let me know. Just contact me. I say it to everyone. So I'm saying it on this podcast, I always do. Just reach out, DM me, ask me, and I'll
Yep.
help. That's the thing is that the stuff we're doing behind the scenes, I know you do the same, mate, is that it's to help. This is something, and you don't keep it to yourself. Whether you're struggling, whether things are going well, whatever it is, let's share and work. If something's working, let's share that out in the market. If you're actually having some trouble, happy to have a conversation on the side to help you out. Don't do anything alone. And I think we are a lot of
Yeah.
lone wolves in cyber, and we're trying to solve a lot of things and carry a big burden on the shoulders that we sometimes need to unload. So, sharing that load can make a big difference. So I think the event's a good way of doing that. Getting peers in the room, having conversations, sharing the information. If people can go away and get 1 or 2 or 3 tips that they can go straight back in their organisation and use, which I'm sure they'll get from you and the people that we see on the the panels. It's an outstanding list of people that are going to be available there. You just only need one really good idea to go away with and say, that's shifted me, that's changed. I'm going to go and do that in my business now. And that can make a real difference. So, yeah, I think I'm looking forward to seeing you on day one and seeing you present because, yeah, I love your stuff, always have. I remember in Adelaide when you were on stage there when I was sitting there, and anytime I've seen you and you did a panel on that year as well on day one, I just think what you say and the way you deliver it. If people aren't already following you, make sure they follow you on LinkedIn because there's a lot of gold in the post that you're sort of putting out there. Get to any events that you're talking at because you do a lot of events as well. We just got to keep sharing this messaging and keep presenting and posting stuff out there, and hopefully something hits. It's you just got to keep chipping away because eventually we've got to move this because we don't seem to be making progress. It was one call every 8 minutes, to the government, to the hotline. Now it's every 6 minutes, right?
6
And
minutes.
unfortunately, I think it might be 5 or 4. And that's still underreporting. It's probably only 1 in 8 or 1 in 6 people are actually calling when they have an incident. That one I spoke about 20 grand the other day hasn't even been reported to the government. That happened before Christmas. So how many more are like that where it's just, it's only 20 grand, I'll just deal with it. Or it's, whatever the amount is, there's a lot of people just not reporting or paying the ransom. Small business, I've heard of a hairdresser paying the thing just so they can get their business back on track, right? It's underreporting. So the problem is billions and trillions of dollars. I mean, it's $10 trillion it's forecast to be this year in cybercrime. That's bigger than drug trade. That's bigger than the global drug trade. And why would you be trying to traffic drugs when you could just get online with a little ransomware kit and go make more money, without having to traffic stuff across borders and manufacture and, carry guns and cash. It's just, we're in a pivotal moment right now. And I think the stuff you're doing, I just want to say, is so important. Like you, you like me, I'm passionate about this stuff, and Tom, and the reason we're doing all the things we're doing is to try and move the needle on this and actually make change. But we'll keep popping our heads up here and trying to make a difference. And Tom and I just wanted to thank you for being on here and all the stuff that you share because it does make a difference. And I know a lot of people love and respect what you do.
I've got just one last thing as we kind of wrap this one up. And the last few nights on the news, what we've seen up in North Queensland is we've seen the electricity's out. I was looking at footage of people lining up to get diesel for generators for the ones lucky enough to have it up there. You know what that made me think is we got great muscle memory in this country about responding to fires, floods and things like that. You talk about that passion for securing critical infrastructure. If the electricity went down like that at that volume with a cyber attack, I don't believe we've got the teams of people to fly in. We've just deployed an extra 20 specialised SES workers up there. This is going to be a confronting period for our country when and if this happens. So, I mean, do you think we'll hit that in 2025? Do you think, how unprepared are we for a major critical infrastructure kind of hit? Maybe even like poisoning the water supply, like there was an attempt in the States a few years ago. What do you think, Chirag?
Yeah, Tom. Look, I mean, that's the scary scenario, right? And look, predictions are tough business, but what I'll say is there have been reputable advisories out made public for a reason. We saw that there were nation states called out specifically for what they were doing, and people know what I'm talking about. Is look at those advisories, which is not very common for governments to come together to actually call out countries. So which means that there is a real threat, and even the ASD report that is publicly available for everyone that talks about we are entering one of the most dangerous or perilous period since World War II from a strategic perspective for our country. Uh, and this is where the work that what we are doing is, I think, the right steps. Is we have actually put some teeth in the legislation. We are going hard at it as a country. We actually consulted widely with the, that's what I give credit to our like, I know our regulators and the government can take some slack and from negative feedback, but in where, and this is across multiple governments, right? Just not this current government, even the previous government, which put the first strategy in, and then this government's kind of gone out and done more work. I think I've seen that evolution of, okay, we've actually defined some good rules, some common sense things that go into defining systems of national significance versus broad critical infrastructure. I think that was really important. When you actually have that specialized list of system of national significance who have an enhanced, requirement for security, I think you're starting to see that good culture coming in. I think there are exercises now that are being run that kind of simulate this across multiple sectors. So I think it's all steps in the right direction. Are we prepared? I think sadly we won't know until something happens and then we're able to respond to it. But we need to put these things in play. But I also think the evolution of certain industries is going to be we'll need to move that much faster. So
Mm,
financial services, energy, I think they had strong regulations. Even telcos had them, but some did not. Like this, which is why I'm really glad. And Jason, you mentioned that where the healthcare industry, one of the most suffering ones, and has a real consequential impact on people's lives. Now you have some money coming into forming a health ISAC there. Like this is
mm,
a small step, but a step in the right direction. To me,
mm,
those need a massive uplift because if you look at data breach reports, even I'm not even talking about human lives. I'm just talking data breaches. The it's healthcare breaches on an average cost approximately $10 million,
nice.
whereas the
Mm,
general thing is like 4.3 or 4.8 million.
mm,
So there's some industries like utilities that are like not power supply or energy, water. I think those might need a faster uplift.
mm,
And the challenge that we have is the blending, and we call this convergence of OT and IT that we talked about. The challenge is we still haven't. We pay lip service to it. We still talk about things like air gapping, which means that
mm,
it, reality is there is actually very little air gapping, if any.
mm,
Right? If you're using smart technology, if you're using cloud to do analysis on your operational technology sensors, which most people are, because that's the way you can actually get things. You have predictive maintenance coming in, you have remote maintenance coming in, you don't have an air gap. And
mm,
I think things like that, right, is where we need to think in terms of our readiness. We need to actually, even beyond resilience and response, which is important, the readiness aspect of it needs to evolve. So I think this is why, people ask me, Chirag, what's your focus for 2025? I think there are two things for me: critical infrastructure and cyber risk quantification. And I picked
mm,
these two for that exact reason, Tom. Is defensible investments, we talked a lot about that, but then critical infrastructure is actually going in, making sense of all the regulatory changes and not just saying, oh, we got to comply with stocky. No, no, no. Actually, let's think about how to become resilient, and Socky gives you a guidance to make that happen. So I want to give a shout out. I think the government does some really good work, and and I've been part of the public consultations, town halls that they do. Uh, Really good work to get the industry engaged, get people to come in and actually respond. So that's about as far as you can go as a government to put in the right means.
mm. Yeah, and I think on the flood thing, what surprised me, and this could have a cyber link back, is these places keep flooding, but no one's building their houses on stilts. Still, yeah, it's like I mean, after Cyclone Tracy, Darwin said you got to build stuff cyclone proof, right? And then we keep having these floods in these same zones, and you see those signs where it's got 1 meter, 2 meter signs, and it shows this is the flood from 1974, all that sort of stuff, and people still building their fucking houses at ground level. It just drives me batty. I'm
Yeah,
like,
that's
how are they done on stilts? Like, what's going on?
It's a great example of where
Instant response
regulation
afterwards, right?
actually plays a role because like in Sydney, they actually after the floods last year out in those big kind of plains they just
Mm,
handed to developers, they've actually
mm,
pulled land back now because of
yep.
at the time it's like a lot of these things, smoking, the cost to the health industry basically dictated the cost of cigarettes we have now in order to change
Mm.
people's behaviors. They've got to a point now where they're struggling with that as well. But anyway, we're off topic, so I'm just gonna
No, we're on
wrap this
topic,
up.
Tom. We're on topic. It still
On
has a
topic.
relation, and I think, and what Chirag's saying, and just to wrap up, I think
Mm,
I would say is we need to drive stuff back to known knowns. Like in cybersecurity, you can talk cyber, but if you said to someone after a flood, if they brought in a law saying we need to lift up the houses and build, on a minimum 1.5 raise, on stilts or whatever, because of flood levels, that's going to protect your house in the future, because we get flooded every 4 years or something like that, right? Every 7 years, whatever it is, you're going to be living here for a period of time. You're going to need to start building houses, or any new houses built are going to have to be built up to that level, right?
mm.
And after a cyber attack, this is why legislation changed. The best thing that can happen sometimes is a cyber attack happens, because it opens people's eyes and that makes them get on their toes and protect something. It's like, when something happens, if it is looked upon by the larger community, then things will change, right? And we got to keep bringing it there. And unfortunately, and as we've said before, the only time it changes, it seems to be if there's a major cyber attack. And as
sadly
Chirag
yes.
said, you don't want to get it to the point where your water supply gets poisoned, electricity's down, or they cut gas lines or something of that nature, because it only take a couple of days for things to get really out of hand in a country like Australia with the spread of
Mm.
population that we have. And That's the risk, the real risk, and that's what government are trying to do their best. But we have to work collaboratively together to actually make any change. It can't be just the government or the industry or the academics. It has to be everyone working collaboratively together to actually make that happen. And I think that's something that we all agree on here. And I hope that that's the message we really need to get out to the broader public, is that it shouldn't wait for a cyber attack or a major incident. We need to be well prepared before that. There's no use doing fire drills, because the likelihood of having a fire in your business and doing quarterly drills is bugger all. But the likelihood of a cyber attack, as we always say, it's not if, it's when. It's happened or it's happening, and you might not even be aware, but you need to be prepared.
And my last natural disaster image is out of those LA fires. There was a strip of houses right on the beach, and there was one house standing. They're all mansions. And immediately journalists were like, why is that house still standing? They went to the builders. Well, we didn't expect there were a fire, but we built it with that in mind.
Right.
And it's the only one still standing. But unfortunately, of that run of 50 houses, there was only one person who took that proactive approach. And that's really what we've got to change, isn't it? We just got to embed that in what we do. Look, thank you so much, Chirag, for joining us. Thank you, Jason, as always. That was a fantastic conversation. It's a really, really important one. And what we're going to be doing out at Murphin Group at the CISO Quantum Conference, we're going to be filming some of the speeches, grabbing some people. So jump onto our YouTube channel and our social channels, and you'll see a whole bunch of great content coming out of that, really kind of sharing, some of the stories and ideas and where we need to go. Because look, at the end of the day, Chirag, Jason and I, we built Murphin Group to build that cyber community, to put our effort and time into growing it. And that it's wonderful to hear that feedback in the beginning that, you guys are seeing that. And being part of that journey, because that's what it is. It's about bringing us all along together. So, listeners, dive into 7 Rules Cyber. Have a look at the book. 7 simple tips. I love frame sticky ideas, destination postcards. You've heard me talking about this. If you're able to frame the work you're doing, it gives you structure, and it allows you to hit in key result areas and targets, and you can actually make some difference in ground. So thank you again. I'm really looking forward to seeing you both host this amazing event. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. Thank you, Jason and Chirag.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much for having me.